MCQ 24, we have our focus now being shifted towards the nervous system. So nervous system has two forms of pathway. In this case here, we have the reflex pathway, which is otherwise considered as the voluntary pathway. And we also have, as mentioned, the voluntary pathway. So reflex could be separated into a spinal reflex or a cranial reflex. Now, what justifies a spinal or the cranial reflex is where is the action and sensation actually being perceived. So, a spinal reflex would be for anything that is perceived below the neck, and for the cranial reflex, anything that is above the neck. So, if you look at the scenario that the question has given to us, we are touching a very hot pan. So this is quite of a dangerous situation. I'll say that the question here is largely focused on a reflex action and not that of our voluntary action. So immediately the arm muscles contract and pull the hand away. Now since the finger is beneath the neck itself, we'll be looking at a spinal reflex. So the arc here we're going to look at is, we're going to start off first with the stimulus, which in this case I'll just have it as heat. The heat will be detected by a suitable receptors. We'll have it as the thermal receptors that's found on the skin of the finger. Thermal receptors, upon detecting the heat, will then give rise to the generation of nervous impulse. So some might learn this as electrical impulses. They are synonymous, they are the same. Nervous impulse will then be first sending it over towards the sensory neuron. Sensory neuron will then pass on these impulses towards the relay neuron. Now the relay neuron will actually has two sites that it should go to. Now one of them will be going over to the brain. Now the brain in this case here has no action, no role in determining the action, but rather it's really more for perception, to feel the event that's actually happening. But relay neuron will also simultaneously send towards the motor neuron. The motor neuron will then have the impulse go towards the motor end plate, and the motor end plate will then terminate the impulses at an effector. Now the effector over here could be a muscle, it could also be an endocrine gland. So effector here will be very much relatable towards the arm muscles that we're actually trying to pull it away from there. Now, a few things here to add is that the impulse from relay to brain and the impulse from relay to motor is not constant. It's actually going to be much slower to the brain and much faster towards the motor neuron. And this itself causes us to react before perception. Now, this is a sequential portion, although we don't really feel the difference in that because nervous impulses in general, they are really very fast. So the difference, the delay is actually quite difficult for us to detect. So the part of the nervous system that perceives the pain is going to be the brain. The brain, again, is for the perception of the pain, but in the coordination of the arm movement, it is being done via the spinal cord over for here, because this is a spinal reflex. The spinal cord itself initiates the action. Alright, so the answer for this question here is A. Now, if let's say it was a cranial reflex, just a little bit of an extension, if it was a cranial effect, the perception is still similarly done by the brain itself, but the action, because it's a cranial reflex, is also being initiated by the brain. So you can see that regardless of the kind of reflex, the brain is always involved in the perception event. Again, the answer for question 24 is A.